So in this video, I'm going to talk about everything you need to know about MCP as an AI automation agency owner. I know it's the hottest trend right now in the AI space. So I'm just going to break it down really simple so you guys can understand everything. And also, surprise, Voiceflow might be having its own MCP server really soon. So stick to the end of the video and I'll be showing you guys what I meant by that. So MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. You've probably heard of it all over the internet right now, but let me just break it down so simple that even if you're not technical, you can still understand what's going on behind the scene and what it means to you as a AAA owner. So up to now, we have LLMs, which is the bread and butter of the AAA model, right? So, but LLMs themselves, like GPT-4o, they don't mean anything. They do things obviously, but they're not powerful enough to actually perform real world actions unless these LLMs are chained with tools, right? So right now, if you have an LLM, let's say OpenAI, and you wanted it to perform an action, for example, send a message to a WhatsApp user, or if it were to check the, let's say, Google Calendar, or it were to send an email to a very specific user, it has to use APIs, right? So you will have an LLM, and you would use an API to change different tools. So let's say you have the first tool is you send an email, and second tool, let's say you want to check the Google Calendar, and the third tool could be, you're checking WhatsApp, etc. Right? So you have these three different tools that you can use, right? So you use APIs, but the problem is, as you probably know, when you configure these APIs, right now APIs are kind of unique in the sense that it's up to the kind of service provider to configure the API, and each API is unique. They're different to each other. So you need to set different things up, as you probably know, when you do a make flow or an end flow. You will need different component of an API, right? You probably need to refer to the API documentation because each service provider sets up different APIs differently. But the problem then comes, basically, LLM actually needs to perform actions, right? We go over this. It's not surprising. Each API configuration is different, right? So what if we actually have, rather than 3 tools, you have like 20 tools, right? Making it like so that it's extremely large or so-called complex systems, like you have like the tool number 4, tool number 5, you have tool number 6, right? You have dot dot dot, right? Then it would take a long time, at least, I mean, for developers even, to actually go through the API documentation like separately and actually try to configure these APIs. It would require a lot of time and effort. And in computer science, at least, or in engineering, we love standardization. We love a way to be able to standardize these kinds of things. So what we have right now in Voiceflow is that usually because we have to mention about the Voiceflow MCP, so I might as well just mention MCP in the context of Voiceflow. Because within Voiceflow, right now, if you were to call a function, you would use the API step, right? So let's say you want to schedule a event in Google Calendar, you would make a make.com workflow, right? Or an NAN flow and then you connect a you can connect some sort of workflow, right? And some sort of webhook, and then you can have a bunch of, well, this is linear, but you can have a bunch of LLM steps, and then you can, for example, send some HTTP request to Kennedy to kind of look for free slots, and then you can book the available slots, etc. Right? And these is these are basically workflow, right? And this is nothing new. You just use an API step within a voice flow to call these make workflow. Well, if you've noticed recently in Voiceflow, they have a new agent step, right? So in the new agent step, they actually have something called the function calling. So as an example, this is basically a travel agent that I've built, and I explained that extensively in a video about the agent step within Voiceflow. So you can check the link in the description to actually watch the full video if you're not familiar with the agent step. But basically, within the flight search agent, you can see that within the agent step, you have different functions, right? And you will have one of them, the search flight function, which is doing a live internet search about the available flights right now based on the user's information. And as you basically know, as you can see, that there's an LLM description basically instructing the LLM to trigger this when this happened, and it requires these input variables, for example, the number of bags, number of children, number of adults, return date, outbound date, etc. Right? And if you click on it, it's essentially requiring these kind of variables to send this to a webhook to a make.com automation, right? So that's a function calling, right? Because you instruct the LLM within the instructions of the AI agent step to essentially trigger this, for example, trigger the, where is it? I'm trying to find it. It's somewhere around here. Yeah, exactly. So in the conversation example, it's agent search flight function. So basically, you kind of prompt or cue the agent to, hey, this would be a good time to activate this search flight function. And as well with the LLM description, right? This is what we call a function calling or a tool calling, right? So you basically add instructions to let the agent know, okay, activate this function or activate this flight confirmation function when X happened and the user has inputted certain variables, right? This is nothing new. This is just how agentic AI works and how functions or tool calling work. Well, now what people are saying is that, well, is there a way to make this even simpler, that you don't actually need to do all these instruction work within the agent step or the function calling step? Is there a way that we can standardize the way that basically LLMs communicate with these different tools, right? So basically, if there's a more complex systems than previously mentioned, what can we do? Well, that's where the MCP, the model context protocol comes in, right? So it's being done by Anthropic, as you're probably aware. By Claude is the first one to kind of come up with this idea. And if I highly recommend you guys, if you want to explore this further and actually know more about this, actually go to this is the official MCP stage, like MCP by Anthropic, and you can see, you can read along. They have the architecture diagram and they have a list of example servers, example clients, etc. So if you want to play around yourself, like, feel free to. But essentially, MCP is a new standardized way to connect LLMs and tools, right? So it allows any LLMs that supports this protocol, right, to interact with servers instead of just API. So what will happen here is the user, instead of interacting directly with these tools, with APIs directly, you interact with servers, which are built by the companies that host these tools. So, for example, Google would build their own Gmail server, and it would build their own Google Canada MCP server, and Meta would build their own WhatsApp server, for example, instead of just using APIs to access the tools, right? Now, I highly recommend you, if you haven't heard of this before, to go through this article, which I will also link in the description. It's really, really simple article that allows basically anyone to understand what this is. Like, much of the kind of diagrams I've put here is actually come from this, because it makes it really easy to kind of understand what this is. And kudos to the Voiceflow team. Actually, they actually provide this kind of resources in the dev hours, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. But basically, they use what we call a client-server architecture, right? So if I just client-server architecture. So essentially, if you think about it like a MacBook, right? If anyone who is using Mac, you know the problem that you can't just directly plug a USB in, right? You need to use what we call a USB-C port, right? Because you can't just plug USB in. You need to use some sort of adapter. So that's exactly what the MCP architecture looks like. Think of The MCP architecture has three parts. First, you have the MCP host. You need a way to host the MCP, which is by Claude or OpenAI, or basically the IDE such as Cursor or Windsurf, right? So these are where you host the entire protocol. Think of these as the LLMs mainly, right? And the second part is the MCP client. So where you actually have a connection with the server, right? You need a client and a server, right? The client and the server. The client is basically your Python script that's being run on your laptop, right? And then you have the MCP servers, right? The MCP servers, as I explained, is basically a server that's built by the company that allows you to connect to the client, right? So Slack has its own Slack MCP server. Google will has its own Gmail MCP server. Google Canada will has its own Google Canada MCP server, right? And just bear in mind that local data sources, so for example, your own folders or your directories, you can build your own MCP server as well, right? And the MCP will be a protocol that acts as like the middleman or like the bridge between these different MCP servers and the client side, which is your Python script, right, that runs on your laptop, right? So the MCP is basically like the middleman, essentially. And just something to kind of bear in mind is that each server will has its own actions, right? So within the, let's say, Gmail or Google Calendar account, right, it will has its own list of actions. For example, check for availability, that will be an action. For example, schedule an event, that will be another action that's happening within the server, right? But let's say Google Sheets, right? It's very similar. This is a really good analogy, which is when you go to Make, when you access a tool, you will have different actions that you can perform, right? Similarly, a MCP server will have a list of actions. So, for example, the Google Sheets MCP server will has different actions that you can take. For example, watch new rows, add a row, update a row, for example, right? Similar to how within a make.com module, you can have different actions that you can take. The key thing is that you don't build the actions, right? Because the action is already being configured by the companies that create this service, right? Google, for example, will already take care of the actions, so you don't build it yourself. And the thing is, it's dynamic in the sense that the LLM, remember LLMs are the MCP host, like Claude, right? They can choose which action to use or fulfill the user request. So instead of you having to explicitly prompt, like in the agents tab, here in the agents tab where you have to write a big prompt of when to use which tool, the LLM will automatically has access to the tools that's available within the MCP server. So the LLM can actually choose which action to use based on the user's query dynamically. That's the key difference between this, the MCP, and the agent step, the tool calling step, right? And remember that servers are what you actually need to interact with those tools. So the servers, right? You have a MCP, let's say Google Canada server. That's basically what you interact with in order to access the, let's say, book, right, or a schedule book or a check for availability tool, right? The MCP server basically is what you interact with, right? And another thing to note is that nowadays, like Zapier, for example, has its own MCP. And if you don't know, Zapier is like it's similar to Make.com or like NAN, where like you can run your own automation workflow. It's like an automation platform. So these kind of automation platforms, starting with Zapier, is starting to build their own MCP server as well. So I can imagine that in the future, Make and NAN will, well, I think NAN already has it, so you can configure your own MCP, but they will have some sort of specific node for MCP. I could imagine that happening in the future, right? But just to make it clearer, well, this is actually the diagram from the Anthropic, right, from the Claude official website, which is basically what we talked about, right? You have the host, the client, which is your LLMs or your IDEs with Cursor or Windsurf, for example. Then you have the MCP servers, the Google Calendar, Gmail server, right, or Slack server, and the protocol basically dictates, or MCP, which is the protocol, acts as like the middleman between to facilitate the communication between the host with the client and the server, right? And then the server can then access the actual tool or the data source, right? Which is basically what we covered here. But this is slightly more abstract than showing you this. I think this is actually easier for you guys to understand, because I think we all know this problem of like connecting the USB-C port. So I think that's a really great analogy. Now, I want to go a little bit more about servers. So servers are pre-built by the companies, as I explained, and they contain all the tools that the LLM has access to and the input variables that's required to run them. So remember, in the agent step, you actually need to specify what input variables, like user, you has to specify these variables, right? And you need to specify what tools it has. Well, not anymore, because the companies now, the difference is, rather than you having to define all of that, the company building these servers will do this for you. It will basically contains all the tools and input information, and it will automatically run all the necessary APIs. So let me just give you an example to see it yourself. Is if you go to let's say a Google Maps MCP server, right? And within the Google Maps MCP server, you can see the list of tools that Google Maps MCP server has access to: the Maps GeoSite, Maps Reverse, for example, Maps Search, right? And also not just the tools, but the inputs, right? The query, which is a string, location, radius, right? It's essentially like an open API schema, right? So there's a setup, and then you can just follow the setup to actually run this on whatever IDEs you have, right? So hopefully that gives you an idea of the MCPs, like, because this is all built in, right? You don't define this yourself. The company Google has already provided tools and the required input variables, right? Hopefully that's clear. And yeah, so if you want to look for more servers, well, you can actually go to the Anthropic website, and if you go to click on example servers, then you can have a list of developer servers like GitHub, Google Drive, PostgreSQL, Slack, for example, right? So feel free to have a play around these servers if you want to. And yeah, that's pretty much about MCP. So hopefully you have an understanding, a basic understanding of what MCP is. Now, before I get into the Voiceflow MCP, I want you to notice something, which is essentially great, right? MCP is great. You have a standardized way of communication. Right? But for us as AAA owners, I think actually if you go back to here, what we normally do is you set up a make.com workflow, right? But did you realize that in the traditional make.com flow that you normally build within AI automation, you don't actually use that much APIs? Like, sure, you have like, for each workflow, you might have like 1, 2, or like 3 APIs max, probably. Like most of the builds that I build, like I use like a maximum of 3 APIs per like system, not per workflow, per system. So it basically gives the question of, well, if you only use 2 to 3 APIs per workflow or per system, is there an actual need for MCP for us as AAA owners, right? Because we're not trying to build the most complicated systems. We're building automation systems that actually helps businesses, right? For example, a customer support agent, an inbound voice caller agent, an outbound voice agent, for example, right? These are all like systems that don't actually use that much APIs. Like, yeah, sure, the most it does is like interact with an external CRM like Go High Level, right? Or Airtable, whatever, right? Or Google Sheets. But like this is like it's very easy, right? To just like, especially with low code tools nowadays, like you don't need to write your own APIs and configure your own APIs. It's actually really easy for AAA owners to just use the existing API, to do the APIs yourself rather than using this, right? Because this right now, I know it will change, but like right now, you need to run your own like GitHub. Like you need to go through the files GitHub yourself, and you need to set it up on yourself in your own IDE with like Win. I know it's easier now with like with stuff like Windsurf and Cursor, but like it's still an extra work compared to just these, right? So I wouldn't So there's a question mark of like, is it actually necessary? Maybe in the future, like when these MCP has actually been implemented as like into the local tools, then it would make sense. But now it's just more work for us that's not necessary at the moment. That's just my opinion. But I think eventually we do have to adopt it, right? Because it's become more and more standardized. More companies are building these. Essentially, more companies are building these MCP servers, and more people are doing it. So we kind of have to adopt it, right? But as of right now, like I would just stick with the APIs to be honest, or if like we'll just do the functions call to be honest. But we'll see. We'll see. Now the big news is that in this is actually 2 days before when you see this, they have the Voiceflow actually has its own developer office. So if you just click here, one of the developers from the Voiceflow team, actually I think his name is Nicholas. He was really really clever guy, and he's really nice, and he actually gave out a bunch of resources within the Discord community, which is actually accessible for everyone. So it's not a secret. Basically, it's more public use, like public viewing. So it has a lot of information that you can go through yourself, which I've kind of covered already, but I covered most of it. But if you want to go through it yourself, feel free to. And essentially, what happens during the developer office is I think Nicholas actually showed a Voiceflow MCP server. Now, the disclaimer is that this is not an actual feature yet, it's just a proof of concept, right? It's just POC. But just to show you guys the abstraction, the kind of idea behind of what could be coming to Voiceflow. Now, I'm not within the Voiceflow team. Like I don't know if I don't know when they're going to release that, but I think they are going to like have that at some point, right? But essentially, just to show you guys kind of what's going on behind the scene, right? Is that normally within an AI agent in your agent within a Voiceflow, you will have a query, right? Let's say you are a conversational agent and you're asking what is the weather in the US, and now you will have a bunch of within your trace, you will have a bunch of stuff that we will have a lot of conversational IDs, you will have user IDs, right? You have all the contextual information as long as security. Cool. Now, they now have something called the Voiceflow MCP API, which honestly is pretty cool. Like, I know we talked about in MCP. Remember we need a client and the server, right? And the host. But the host is obviously the cloud, right? And then the client, well, in this case, you will need a client. Well, because this is from the agent side, right? It's not a client. You need to build basically an external client in order to actually be able to interact with these MCP servers. So the client, once you build this client layer, and you basically contains information like user ID, conversational ID, and the query. Now, the reason why you would want to include these user ID or conversational ID is as follows. Because this is a conversational agent, the question that user asks will likely be related to the second question or follow-up question the user is asking. For example, if the user is asking what's the current time in New York right now, and the Voiceflow agent replies the answer, and the user then asks, okay, well, what's the weather like, right? Then that's where the context comes in, because clearly the user wants to know the weather in New York, right? Because they asked about the time in New York. So that's where this context, this conversational ID and user ID comes into handy, so the agent has all the information it needs to decide which variables to use and which tools to use in the MCP service. Now within Voiceflow MCP service, now they have like get time, right? Which is get the current time, the weather server, which is pretty standard, and you have the Google Calendar and Playwright. If you don't know, Playwright is basically a Microsoft server for like web browsing essentially. And you can also have like something called Brave API, Brave Search. Brave Search is basically where you an MCP server that allows you to do like live web-based research, right? And you can also have third-party MCP servers like Zapier and Brave Search, exactly what I talked about, right? So Zapier, we kind of covered it. Brave Search, I literally just talked about it. So it will have all these different MCP servers, these different tools available for the Voiceflow to kind of use and send a response back to the client and specifying which tools it used, which is the weather. For example, if the user asks what's the weather in New York, it will reply with like weather, get weather, and which tool it used, right? So it's pretty standard. Again, get the MCP servers, query, get the user conversations, clear the conversations, and clear user conversation, right? It's a pretty beautiful alignment, if you ask me. But let's actually see what's happening. So what happened was, I think Nicholas actually released a GitHub folder that you can have a look. And if you want to, you can actually run this yourself right now in your own IDE like Windsurf or Cursor, right? Just literally follow the instructions here and you'll be good. And the thing that you would only need is your Anthropic API key, your Brave API key, which you can set up, and also some Google Canada configuration, which if you use Make before with Google Cloud, you kind of know that you kind of already know this like annoying stuff that you need to do. But yeah, basically go through the steps, and then here is exactly what I meant by the available tools within the Voiceflow MCP service. You can have Playwright, you can have Brave Search, and you can have Time MCP, Weather Server, etc. Right? And just follow the setup, and you should be able to get it running. Now, within the GitHub folder that the Voiceflow team has shared, you also have this MCP Agent Voiceflow file. So you can download this Voiceflow file and actually plug it into Voiceflow right now. And this will be what you get. So let me just actually run through this kind of flow really quickly. So the start of the MCP flow is that this is just initializing the memory, and you will have an API. So the API will be getting information, it's a GET request, to retrieve information from the MCP client from the MCP service, right? So this is exactly the service that you will set up within your GitHub, within your GitHub folder. So if you run this in your you follow the instructions and run this in your IDE, you should be able to access it, and it will basically contains a list of tools, right? MCP available tools available to the agent, and then it will turn this into a string, right? JSON.string file, and it will pass with the conversational agent. Now it's pretty standard, but what changes is that if you save within the instruction of this agent, you have a subheadings called MCP2 feature, right? You have access to the following tools. You want to check if you can use any of the available MCP tools to answer and prioritize the item over a direct answer, right? So you can provide the tool schema, which is what you retrieve from the MCP service that you set up. Now, the advantage of this is basically you don't have to list out all the tools that you have within the agent step now. Now you can just save this. You can just do a GET API request to your own MCP server and list out all the tools available, plug it into a variable, save it into a variable, and put this in the instruction within the agent step, and you're good to go. See how much shorter the prompt is compared to like this? So hopefully that kind of gives you the idea of like where MCP can be powerful to. And here you don't need to write your own functions because your paths will be the MCP tools, right? So it will basically the LM can choose from the available tools and actually access the tools, right? And it will then go through the MCP tools, and there will be a function for the MCP tool. Now I don't want you to get too complicated, but like, because I know like this is no longer a low code solution. Like a lot of it is kind of coded, custom coded. But basically, what this does essentially is you take the user ID, query, and conversational ID, which we covered in this diagram, right? This is this client, the information that is needed within the client side, and actually run through a function of the MCP tools, which MCP tools to use, and basically output which tools they have chosen, the tools respond, which tools the LLM has decided to use, the answer that it gave, basically the response to the user, and basically error if an error occurs, right? The function, like you can see here, the function. Wait, let me actually make it larger. The function will use MCP tools to help users with their request, right, and return an answer. And again, this can take a while to respond first, then call the tools. The MCP tools can use multiple tools to help with user query. So that's the really key part, because in the function calling step, you choose either one. You have to basically force yourself to choose one function, right? But now the MCP tools allows you to it runs in the background. The LM knows, okay, I need to use A, B, C. For example, what's the current time in New York? Well, you will need to know you will use a tool which is get the current time, and you will also probably need to know what is the current date and time, and what is you fetch the. For example, what is the weather in New York? Well, you need to basically use the weather app, right? And also the get time tools. So you will need two tools in order to capture the response. So that's where the MCP tool is going to come in handy, is in the thing that it can run multiple tools. So I highly encourage you to kind of play around with this. Again, everything you need is within this Developer Labs page. So I would put the link in the description, and you guys can play with it if you want, and hopefully that will give you an idea of what a Voiceflow MCP server would look like in the future. So hopefully this has been helpful for you guys, and if you've got any questions, just let me know in the comments, and if you run into any problems that needs debugging when you actually play with this, because I know it can be a little bit tricky with the code, so just let me know in the comments. I'll try my best to help. And if you want me to cover anything else, just let me know. And yeah, I'll see you next time.